So hello and welcome to this video on Punch from Patching Panda. Let's check out what's to come. So Punch is a dual channel decay accent dynamic generating VCA, but let me go through it. That's a bit of a mouthful and quite a lot to take in. Punch is two channels of VCAs where we can input a sound to either channel, left or right, output that sound, trigger an internal decay envelope with shape and decay time control. We can CV those decays as well, but the key part is that we get an accent control and an accent level, allowing us to create dynamic VCAs, but also dynamic envelopes, as we can take those envelopes out of the module and use them elsewhere in the system. You can also on these switches invert the envelopes coming out. So if you want to use an envelope to create a sound and use an inverted version patched out to kind of sidechain it against something else, or have something rise while something else falls in level, you can get quite creative. So let's get into some patches. So in this first patch, we're using one side of Punch to create a kick drum, using a sine wave oscillator from elsewhere in the system, and the right hand side to create some noise. And there's some 16th note hi-hats just ticking away. So this is using everything on Punch to create a really dynamic and much more interesting bass drum, or just percussion sound out of a sine wave oscillator. I'll kind of pull things out, kind of cancel it out if you like as we go, and we'll build back up to where we got to. So simply, here's a sine wave at the input to the left channel, my trigger pattern, and my actual output that we're recording. Now the green trace on data is my envelope. I've currently just pulled that out because I am routing it elsewhere. The blue trace is the actual audio output from Punch. And it's just a low sine wave. The shaping and the decay control is great for just making nice, thumpy, deep kind of percussion, or nice, tight, snappy noise sounds as well, as we'll see with the snare. But the first thing I wanted to do was add some kind of accent, get this more dynamic, much more interesting. Turning the accent up full, so is the biggest difference between the accent and the normal notes. You just hear it's much more interesting. This is tuned quite low, it's probably quite hard to hear. Make sure you've got some headphones on or some decent speakers. And what I'm going to do is route the envelope out, the envelope generated to control Punch's own VCAs, and route that into the FM input of this sine wave oscillator. And you can really hear that accent bringing out much more life now. If I pull out the accent, still makes for a great kick. Just a simple sine wave oscillator, punch handling the dynamics and the level, also sending the same envelope to the pitch. We get a great kick drum. One nice tip just while we're here, without an accent plugged in, the accent will just serve as a kind of level control. Watch the level of the audio and the envelope on the screen. The next thing that I added was a sequence to decay, so we can change the length of this envelope, which will affect the pitch of this sine oscillator and the internal VCA, of course, on Punch. Far more interesting percussive bass drum in this instance. Now adding some noise back into the right hand side of Punch, I simply have a trigger and an output, no modulation, to give me now pulling those hats back in. There's my beat, and that serves as a kind of feature rundown and demo of what Punch can do. Let's get into some more patches using both sides of Punch, modulating things, running things through it, just generally making things dynamic and punchy. So here's a really simple patch, just demoing this inverted envelope output. Now removing one sound, here's a sine wave oscillator deep into Punch, straight in, straight out, no accent, no decay modulation. I'm not routing the envelope it's generating back into the oscillator like I did in the previous patch where I made a kick. Simple oscillator in, VCA, envelope opens it, job done. Now of course that's useful in itself, however simple that may be for the decay and shape controls. But here I'm taking the envelope output first into data so you can see it, and this is the inverted version. We can have that come up positive. but taking the inverted version into the scope and then out into another VCA, which has simple waveform at its input, I can treat this like a sidechain against the sound that we're hearing. So let's bring that sound up. And this will be very interactive because the envelope that I'm using to duck this external wave is of course the same one that Punch is using to control. So I've just muted out my kick, snare and my two hat sounds from the Patching Panda hats. Those were these sounds for the kick, hats, snare, and I'm using all of these just to kind of back up what's going on and set some kind of musical context. They're much quieter because the main focus here is Punch. Now here's the two sides of Punch, hard panned left and right, so again make sure you've got some headphones on or some decent stereo speakers. This is both sides of Shubi, the little noise source that we've already used, the two outputs into both sides of Punch. I'm triggering them both from the same, using these blue stackables, the same clock source. Their accent patterns are separate random triggers, and I've got individual separate sample and hold to the decay, just to again show this kind of dynamic range of Punch. I'm going to play around with Shubi for a second. So different accents, different timing CV modulations, different sounds to each side in stereo but playing the same core 16th note rhythm, kick, hat, snare to back it up. There's the kind of power and dynamics of Punch spread out in stereo using both sides. So throughout the video so far, we've used Punch for making and creating and modulating percussion, other than that little sidechain trick with the inverted envelope. But I just wanted to use it for melodic, riffs, basslines, melodies, and show how much life and kind of tone and character it can add to synth lines, sequenced melodic musical sequences. So here's two oscillators, both square waves or pulse waves with PWM mixed in a mixer. First going into the left hand side of Punch as a VCA, then into a low pass filter, and I'm using Punch to modulate the filter. Now I can come straight out of what is Punch, and by using that accent we're adding a lot of additional character to the sound. I have some ping pong delay that I'll mute. I could just dial in the right amount of kind of two layers of dynamics between the accent and the normal notes that I want. And I wanted to get this into the VCA before the filter, so any saturation or changes in tone on that filter will be affected by the now dynamic signal from Punch. I'm using the same gate and accent pattern to create an envelope on the right hand side of Punch, and the reason I'm using the other channel rather than taking this one out is I'd like the filter to have different envelopes. Maybe it's linear instead of exponential, and maybe the decay times are different too. So that's coming into data, the blue trace, and let's modulate the filter with it. And again, I can dial in dynamic envelopes, take the envelope out to modulate the filter. I've already got the dynamic VCA envelope combo going into the filter with these oscillators. Just adds a lot of life to musical basslines, riffs, melodies, something that's possibly missing in a lot of modular patches. So I thought it'd be nice just to show that off. So here's just a really quick, simple patch, zoomed in so you can see it on the Modex data, to show that this will process CV. Now the left hand side of Punch has a sine wave at its input from an FM based oscillator. If I remove the modulation, that's what's going on, super simple sound. But then I have an LFO, which is the top trace on data, going into the right side of Punch, coming out of Punch into the FM depth between my oscillators. So the envelope is controlling when this LFO can come through and decaying down the amplitude of that LFO as well. We get dynamic envelope controlled wobbles on our little FM patch, and it's just here to say you can process CV. So here I'm using Punch to process a full synth voice and also deal with sending sound to my effects. In this case, a nice tape-like ping-pong delay. So this voice has some feedback, some drive, some sympathetic strings, and that's coming into channel 1 and then being split on this red stackable into channel 2 as well. Now without the effects, the sound is coming in, as I said, and being split. I'm using a trigger and some CV, which is the stepped sequence on data, to modulate decay time and create a nice kind of moving modulated tremolo-like effect over this full droning voice. The interesting part for me with this patch is using the right hand side to process the same audio but with a different pattern, a much less frequent gate pattern compared to the steady 16th note clock. And this infrequent pattern, no modulation on this channel, is just firing little bits of sound into the delay. So you have a separate gate rhythm imparted on the effects send element in this patch. Mixing the two parts together, turning down the main sound, we can treat this stereo delay like the kind of accent ping-pong spatial main sound, and then this chuggy modulated kind of tremolo level underneath. So that's it for Punch from Patching Panda. Hope you've liked the video. Go back and skip around as you see fit. Of course, leave a comment, thumbs up, support the work I do on patreon.com/DivKid if you like the work I do. If not, have a good day anyway. See you next time. Cheers.